Welcome to Where We Live, a new video series that takes a closer look at the modern human habitat. In each episode, we examine challenges related to health, housing, and transportation. I'm David Hodge, your host. In this episode, we'll explore how the 1954 Highway Act, combined with racism, influenced the size and shape of cities across the United States. Joining us is housing expert Matthew Lewis from California YIMBY.
I'm Matthew Lewis. I am Director of Communications for California YIMBY, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. We're a statewide housing policy and advocacy organization. We have about 80,000 members all over the state of California, and we work mostly in Sacramento with the state legislature to make it easier to build homes in the communities where we need them. 1954 Federal Highway Act, creation of the Federal Highway Administration. Arguably, there were several things that inspired this. One was, Eisenhower's desire to actually create a connected network of roads across the country for the purposes of trade. And it's a pretty pure intent on the merits. It's good to have good transportation networks connecting cities. And in a country as large as the United States, it's vital because you can actually really inhibit economic growth and opportunity if you're not able to physically travel between places. So at the surface level, that makes a lot of sense. There was another argument at the time that was similarly, it was a little further afield, but it kind of made sense within the context, which was there was a growing nuclear threat. And so the government thought we need a way to get people out of cities quickly. The Cold War was a real thing. Russia was an emergent threat at the time, and there was very real talk about a nuclear standoff. So that was another justification for pumping a huge amount of money into the federal highway system. However, the way it ended up being implemented was a little bit different. What cities did was they took this money, and rather than just putting highways out of the city or finding pathways to create trade, which they also did, don't get me wrong, they looked for Black and brown neighborhoods in all the cities in the country and said, you know what? That's actually where the highway needs to go. And it doesn't matter where you go in the United States, you can find a highway where they literally stole the property from Black people, from Asian people, from Latino people, from Jewish people, stole it, took it, razed it to the ground, and put a highway there. The 110 through LA, famously, right through the heart of Black Los Angeles. The 980 in Oakland, again, knocked down one of the most thriving neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods in Oakland. Just knocked it down, just got it out of the way. When you think about the interplay there between the racial implications of single unit housing, the emergence of a highway system that was built on top of Black and brown neighborhoods, you start to see the connection here between the way we think about transportation and the way we have allowed our housing to be built and grown over time in our cities. And what becomes really clear, because we didn't want to allow multifamily housing because that was where non-white people lived. We built single unit housing sprawl, which was more expensive per unit. And so there was this whole thing that emerged called white flight, where we very intentionally took money out of cities that were diversifying and put it into subsidizing suburbs so that we could provide a clean place for white people to live without integration. That white flight was built dependent on freeways that were built on top of Black and brown communities. If we hadn't knocked down those diverse neighborhoods, some of these suburbs might never have come into being because they were completely reliant on the subsidies they were getting, not just from the highways. That was a big piece of it. But there was a whole program that the government had instituted to incentivize and subsidize sprawl, which included down payment assistance and sometimes just pure, here's a house, go move into it. It was very easy for you to get this mortgage if you were white. It was basically impossible to get the mortgage if you weren't, even though we'd already passed these civil rights laws. And here's the thing, that racism in finance isn't over. It's still a huge problem today because the way the banks evaluate borrowers, you're supposed to just look at the credit score and income and blah, blah, blah. But there's been experiments done here in the Bay Area where you had a black buyer go into a home and make an offer, and then they'd be declined because either they couldn't get the financing or whatever that was. They would send in a white dummy buyer, make the same offer, get approved, and get the loan. This is happening in 2022 in the United States of America. So this thread that connects all the way through is this resistance to integrated neighborhoods. And people like to say that, the United States is a horrifically racist country. There's certainly a history of horrific racism. So during the same era of a change in how we zoned our cities, it was really the birth of the environmental movement, not just in California, but across the United States. And during that time, there were huge environmental crises happening all over the state. California and Los Angeles became famous for the smog from car pollution because cars weren't regulated. There was no regulation of pollution at the time. The air was toxic. It was literally making people sick and they were dying. I mean, you just had these days that we think it's bad now. It was much worse 50 years ago, 60 years ago. As a part of this era of environmental awareness, as that was coming on, the state passed a whole host of protections for air quality, for water quality, for coastal conservation. And the real root of all this was the California Environmental Quality Act. And what the law was intended to do was create a process so that if you wanted to do an activity that could potentially cause environmental harm, you had to disclose what those impacts would be and allow the community to give you feedback on how to mitigate those impacts. So on the surface, a mostly well-intended law, right? You don't want to have someone plop down a steel mill in a residential neighborhood because the steel mill will have a high amount of air pollution and it'll be very loud and it might have heavy-duty trucks coming through all the time. And you're just like, there's other ways you can cite industrial uses that still give you the benefit. We need steel, but don't put it right next to a school or in a place where people are living. Fair enough. What quickly emerged, though, was a very cynical approach to the use of the California Environmental Quality Act, where people realized it didn't just block bad uses of land or inappropriate uses of land. It could block any use of land. And all you had to do to stop anything you didn't like was file a lawsuit. And that lawsuit would cost you something like $250. So this opened up the door for a complete misuse of what was supposed to be a way to improve the environment for all Californians. Just to give you an example of how badly this law is abused. In the late 90s, San Francisco was in the process of crafting a citywide plan for both transit and bicycles. It really wanted to accelerate the use of low-impact modes of transport, and in San Francisco, very effective. It's already a pretty transit-oriented city. Most of the city you can ride a bike, and it's got a reputation for hills, but most of the city actually you can ride around no problem. In about 2000, 2001, there was a fellow who decided he didn't want either transit or bicycles. He liked driving his car everywhere he went, and he filed a CEQA lawsuit against that plan. It held it up until last year. The reason San Francisco has not accelerated its transit use and its bicycle use is because a single homeowner in San Francisco filed a lawsuit under CEQA to block bike lanes. To illustrate the absurdity of that, the number one source of carbon pollution in the state of California is cars. So if you're concerned about the environment, the thing you should be thinking about doing the fastest is helping people get out of their cars through, for example, using transit or bike lanes. The California Environmental Quality Act has held up bike lanes all over the state. It has held up transit lanes all over the state. You know what it hasn't done? It has never stopped a freeway. It has never stopped a highway expansion. It has never seemed to have an impact on how our state transportation department spends its dollars. And in fact, as recently as this week, there are activists in Los Angeles in 2022 who are still fighting Los Angeles Department of Transportation, which wants to knock down another Latino neighborhood to build another freeway expansion. if you start on one day and you've got a 4,500 square foot lot and you're allowed to build one unit on it, and then the county comes back and says, no, you need 10,000 square feet to build one unit. That's a downzoning. They've just reduced the number of homes that can be built, because you used to be able to build two homes, right? One on one 4,500 square foot lot, one on the other. And now they said, nope, not enough. That's a downzoning. And that's what cities all over the place did to restrict the number of homes that could be built. That's literally how it works. There's this direct line, again, between, we talked about the racist history of zoning and redlining, but there's also this huge problem of how we fund and think about our transportation systems. Because if you're going to do sprawl like we've done, well, arguably you need the highway capacity, because that's the only way to get around in sprawl.
Thanks for tuning in to Where We Live. If you found today's episode informative, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Join us again in our next episode as we unpack essential health, housing, and transportation issues and how they impact our daily lives. See you next time.